There is a snail in the land of Oo. You have probably never thought about it, and if you have watched Adventure Time casually, the way most people watch a cartoon while doing something else with their hands, you have almost certainly never noticed it at all. It sits on windowsills. It rides in backpacks. It appears without comment in the corner of frames that are supposedly about something else entirely. A boy and his dog wandering off to fight some candy-colored menace. And if you pause the show at the right second in almost any early episode, there it would be, small and shelled and patient, doing nothing, saying nothing, waiting for a moment that would not arrive for 2 full seasons. Tonight we are going to talk about what that snail turned out to be carrying and about the thing underneath the thing underneath the thing, all the way down to the coldest room in the basement of this show's mythology. We are going to talk about the Lich. If you already know the shape of him, the skull, the crown, the fire that burns without any tissue left to burn, you know him as a villain first. That is fair. That is how the show introduced him, and for a long time that is all he was allowed to be. But the Lich is not really a villain in the way Ice King is a villain, which is to say, not really a villain at all in his case, comic and sad and desperate for company. The Lich is something else. He is the show's one truly cosmic idea, the place where Adventure Time stopped being a story about a post-apocalyptic candy kingdom and became, briefly and without ever quite announcing it, a story about the nature of endings themselves. He is older than the dinosaurs. He is older, by his own account, than the universe he lives in. And somewhere inside, a sweet, sensitive little boy who likes patting injured squirrels and going to school for the first time, he is still there, dormant, waiting, the way he has always waited. Because waiting is the one thing that costs him nothing. Get comfortable. This is a long way down. We should start where the show started, with the version of the Lich that existed before he ever appeared as a fully formed character, back when he was 3 sentences in a pitch document that nobody outside the writer's room was ever supposed to see. Adventure Time's original pitch Bible, the collection of notes and sketches that Pendleton Ward put together to describe the show he wanted to make, mentioned exactly 7 characters by name: Finn, Jake, Princess Bubblegum, Lady Rainicorn, Ice King, Marceline, and the Lich King, described, according to the surviving documentation, in a note written entirely in capital letters. The Lich King is not funny. That is the whole instruction. Not a backstory, not a design brief, not a list of powers, just a warning to future writers, underlined by its own insistence that whatever else this show turned into, whatever jokes it made about butts and math and princesses who needed rescuing every 3rd episode, there would be one character standing outside all of that. One character who was not allowed to be a punchline. The pitch document reportedly went on to describe him as imprisoned within his own castle, guarded by a legion of undead skeletal knights, a fairly standard fantasy villain in outline. That version never really made it to screen intact. What did make it to screen, eventually, years later, was something stranger and colder than any castle full of skeletons, but the instinct behind that all-caps warning survived every single revision. He was never funny. Even when the show found a way to make an episode about him genuinely, structurally hilarious, which it did, the Lich himself never once told a joke, or had one told convincingly at his expense. He is the one immovable object in a show built almost entirely out of movable, meltable, reconfigurable things. Pendleton Ward's first choice to voice this character was Tom Waits, whose gravel and smoke speaking voice would have given the Lich a specific kind of world weariness, something closer to a man who has seen every bar close at the same hour for 40 years running. That casting never came together. What the show got instead, and what it kept for the character's entire run, was Ron Perlman, an actor whose own voice carries a comparable weight but a different register, less exhausted and more mineral, something that sounds like it is being spoken through stone rather than through a throat. Perlman had already spent a career playing large, physically overwhelming characters who carried unexpected tenderness underneath their design, Hellboy chief among them, a demon raised to be decent despite everything working against it. The Lich would ask Perlman for the opposite kind of performance, a being who might have once had something like tenderness available to him if he ever had a self capable of tenderness in the first place and chose, or was built, or simply became something that could not access it anymore. Perlman gave him a voice that is almost always quiet, not soft. Quiet in the specific way that things are quiet right before they get much, much louder. The pause before a door gets kicked in rather than the silence of an empty room. The design went through changes too. More than one, according to the people who worked on the show, because the early attempts, by the crew's own later admission, were not frightening enough for what the character was meant to represent. What the show settled on, the design that stuck from his first proper appearance onward, borrows visibly and admittedly from a specific piece of animation history. The Horned King from Disney's 1985 film, The Black Cauldron, an adaptation of Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Prydain novels, and one of the darkest, most unsettling villain designs Disney ever attempted for a theatrical feature, a design so intense that the studio famously trimmed and softened parts of that film for fear of frightening children too badly. The Lich borrows the same architecture, the skeletal frame draped in heavy, torn robes, the crown sitting on a skull rather than a face, hands that are bone all the way down with fire where flesh should be, eyes that are not eyes at all but a pair of small green lights burning in hollow sockets. He is enormous when the show needs him to be. In the flashback that first reveals his defeat at the hands of the legendary hero Billy, he stands nearly as tall as Billy himself, which is to say considerably taller than anything else in the frame. Even at rest, in his stillest moments, he takes up more visual space than the scene seems to want to give him. The way certain objects in certain rooms simply refuse to recede into the background no matter how the light falls on them. The design carries small, consistent marks of his history that the show never explains directly but never removes either. And if you watch closely across his various appearances, you start to notice them accumulating, the way scars accumulate on someone who has lived a long, difficult life. One of his two horns is broken, snapped off at some point that the show implies, without confirming outright, happened during his original defeat at Billy's hands, since earlier flashback material shows both horns intact before that fight. His face itself grows visibly less detailed in his later appearances compared to his first major appearance in Mortal Folly and Mortal Recoil, a small, almost accidental feeling erosion that mirrors, whether intentionally or not, the way everything about him seems to wear down slightly, with each new defeat and each new vessel, never quite returning to the sharpness of his original form. The world he moves through has, in its own way, learned to watch for him. The Gumball Guardians, the towering defensive statues Princess Bubblegum builds to protect the Candy Kingdom, are apparently designed with some capacity to detect his presence specifically, announcing a Lich alert on at least one occasion when he draws near in a borrowed body. Peppermint Butler, the Candy Kingdom's small, courteous butler, with his own well documented and much darker connections to death and the underworld, seems able to sense him as well. A detail the show offers only in passing, without ever building a full scene around it, the way you might mention in passing that someone in your life has always had a strange, unexplained sensitivity to storms coming in from a long way off. None of this, on its own, would have been enough. Plenty of animated shows have built a large skeletal villain with a good voice actor and called it a day. What makes the Lich matter? What makes him worth an entire evening of your attention rather than a footnote in somebody's list of scary cartoon characters is the way the show, slowly, patiently, and almost entirely through implication, built an entire cosmology around him until the villain from the Pitch Bible warning label turned out to be one half of the oldest and most serious idea Adventure Time ever tried to articulate. If you are just settling in for this one, go ahead and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I like knowing where these things land. Somewhere out there, it's already tomorrow, and somewhere, it's still yesterday. And that gap always feels appropriate for a video about a character who exists slightly outside of time in the first place. Now, let's keep going, because the story of who he actually is only gets stranger from here, and we are still very close to the surface. The first time the Lich appears on screen at all is not really an appearance. It is a memory inside somebody else's memory, a flashback embedded in the origin story of Billy, the legendary hero whose reputation looms over Finn and Jake for the show's entire early run, the way a great retired athlete looms over a rookie who has only ever seen the highlight reels. In the episode that gives Billy his introduction, his theme song, sung with the kind of triumphant, over-the-top bravado the show reserves for characters who are meant to feel bigger than life, includes a single line claiming that Billy once cast the Lich King down. That is the entire content of the reveal. One line in a song, delivered with the same cheerful bombast used to describe every other item on Billy's long list of legendary accomplishments. No date is given, no context is offered. We are simply told in passing, the way you might be told in passing that somebody's grandfather once fought in a war nobody talks about anymore, that there was a Lich and there was a fight, and Billy won. It would be almost 2 full seasons before the show returned to that single throwaway lyric and started pulling on the thread. When it did, in the 2-part second season finale called Mortal Folly and Mortal Recoil, it did something the show had not really done before at that scale. It took a threat completely, unglamorously seriously, without providing an escape hatch of comedy to release the tension. The episode opens gently enough, almost misleadingly so, with Finn, Jake, and Princess Bubblegum attempting to meditate together, each of them getting pulled by their own intrusive thoughts. Finn imagining a cooler and older version of himself, Jake drifting toward thoughts of his girlfriend Lady Rainicorn. Princess Bubblegum's mind goes somewhere darker, and when she comes back to herself, she tells the boys she needs to show them something. She leads them into the deep interior structure of the tree that the Candy Kingdom's palace grows from and around, down into a place that the show had never shown before and would rarely revisit with this much specificity again. And there, encased in a massive block of amber, is the Lich, the same figure from Billy's theme song, held motionless and dormant, the way something dangerous gets held when the people holding it are hoping, quietly, that it never wakes up. Princess Bubblegum explains what she knows. Beyond a location called Iceberg Lake lie the ruins of what she describes as the Lich's Tower, where he had once been engaged in converting what she calls the planet's life force into unholy power, intending to use that power to destroy everything in U. If you sit with that phrase for a moment, life force, converted into unholy power, and place it next to what we now understand about the mutagenic aftermath of the Mushroom War, the toxic, radioactive, magic soaked wasteland the bombs left behind, the picture that emerges is not really a wizard's tower out of a fantasy novel. It is something closer to an industrial site, a place where whatever poisoned the earth after the old world ended was being deliberately harvested and concentrated, the way you might harvest and concentrate anything else you found valuable in the wreckage of a civilization, except that what the Lich found valuable was the specific radioactive residue of annihilation itself. Bubblegum gives Finn and Jake jeweled headgear, protective charms meant to shield their minds from the Lich's influence, because simply being near him, awake and aware, carries the risk of losing control of your own thoughts. This is not how the show usually frames a threat. Usually a threat in Adventure Time can be outrun, out-argued, or out-charmed. The Lich is introduced as something you need armor for before you are even close enough to see him move. And then, in one of the more quietly devastating pieces of misdirection the show ever pulled off, it turns out that the danger arrives from somewhere nobody was watching. While the group examines the amber, a snail happens to be present, riding along the way it always rides along, unnoticed, uncommented upon, exactly the way it has ridden along through every episode of the show, up to that point, without a single line of dialogue ever being spent on it. The Lich reaches the snail's mind and uses it, turns its small, unremarkable body into the instrument of his own release, and the amber breaks. For anyone who had spent 2 seasons idly wondering about the recurring background snail without ever expecting an answer, this is the moment the show rewards years of unspoken attention with a genuine narrative payoff, the kind that only works because the joke had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting with the same patience the Lich himself seems to specialize in. What follows is a chase that the show plays almost entirely straight, a tonal choice that critics writing about the episode at the time noted as a genuine departure for a series that had, up to that point, built its identity on undercutting fantasy tropes rather than honoring them. Finn arms himself with Billy's own legendary gauntlet, the weapon that supposedly defeated the Lich the first time, and it fails completely, destroyed by the Lich with what the show frames as almost bored contempt, a villain who has clearly anticipated that his opponents would reach for exactly this weapon and has already planned around it. He shushes Finn and Jake, mid-attack, the way you might shush children who are interrupting something important, and that single gesture tells you more about how the Lich understands his own position in the world than any monologue could have. He is not afraid of Billy's gauntlet. He was never afraid of it. He simply waited for someone to bring it back to him so he could remove it from play permanently. The complications multiply from there in ways that are almost unbearably tense for a show ostensibly aimed at children. Ice King, present mostly because he is pestering Finn and Jake for their blessing to marry Princess Bubblegum, accidentally drops Bubblegum directly into what the show calls the Lich's well of power during the chaos of the fight, and the Lich, defeated in physical form by Finn's improvised use of a sweater Bubblegum had given him, a small, sincere, entirely non-magical token of affection that turns out to matter more than any enchanted weapon, does not simply die. His body is destroyed, his skull cracked open by an attack. Finn only manages because the sweater gives him the emotional grounding to resist the Lich's mental influence at the crucial moment. But something in him survives the destruction of that particular body. And in the second half of the story, in Mortal Recoil, we learn where that something went. His disembodied consciousness has taken up residence inside Princess Bubblegum herself. This is one of the more genuinely unsettling sequences the show ever produced, and the people who made it have said as much in interviews given after the fact. Much of the action takes place confined to Bubblegum's own bedroom, a space the show usually treats as safe, private, entirely hers, and the storyboard artists working on the episode have described deliberately trying to make those scenes simultaneously funny and terrifying. An odd combination that somehow lands exactly as intended. When the Lich speaks through Bubblegum's body, her skin turns a pale, sickly blue-gray. Her hair goes dirty and matted. Her eyes go black, except for small green pupils burning in the center, and her voice drops into something frail and wrong, barely recognizable as hers at all. She asks Finn, in that altered voice, to bring her toxic chemicals, and he does, not understanding what she intends, and she consumes them and transforms into something monstrous, something Finn has to destroy with Ice King's reluctant help before the doctors of the Candy Kingdom can even attempt to save whatever remains of the girl underneath. What they manage to save is not enough to restore her fully. She survives, but the damage costs her years. She emerges from the ordeal, 13 years old again, the same age as Finn, her body unable to sustain the adult form she had built for herself, reduced by the encounter to something smaller and more vulnerable than the competent, composed ruler audiences had come to know. Sit with that for a second, because the show mostly moves past it quickly, the way it tends to move quickly past its own darkest implications, trusting you to notice on your own time rather than dwelling on the horror explicitly. A cosmic being older than the universe reached into the mind and body of a teenage scientist queen and left her physically younger, forcibly regressed, her adult self partially undone, and the show frames the immediate aftermath as bittersweet rather than purely tragic, because Finn gets a hug and a blush out of the whole ordeal, and there is a genuine, if complicated, sweetness in watching two 13-year-olds find a moment of connection amid the wreckage. But it is worth noticing what actually happened underneath that sweetness. Being touched by the Lich, even indirectly, even in defeat, leaves a permanent mark. Nobody walks away from him unchanged. That would remain true for every character who encountered him for the rest of the show's run, all the way to the very end. It is worth pausing, too, on the specific object that actually stops him in that first great confrontation, because the show is quietly, deliberately pointed about what works against a being this old and this powerful, and what does not. Billy's gauntlet, a legendary weapon with a legendary reputation, forged specifically, as far as anyone in Ooh understands, to combat exactly this kind of threat, fails completely and is destroyed, almost contemptuously, the moment it makes contact with him. What succeeds instead is a sweater. An ordinary, hand-given, entirely unmagical sweater offered earlier in the episode by Princess Bubblegum as a simple gesture of affection and reassurance before Finn ever set out on this particular quest. The show never explains this in the language of magic or mechanics. It does not claim the sweater is secretly enchanted or that love itself functions as a literal weapon within this universe's rules. What it shows, instead, is that the specific clarity and steadiness the sweater gives Finn in that moment, the emotional anchor it provides against the Lich's attempt to overwhelm his mind, is enough to let him land a blow that a legendary artifact wielded without that same grounding could not land on its own. It is a small piece of storytelling logic that the show returns to again and again in different forms across its run. The idea that the thing capable of resisting the oldest, coldest force in the universe is rarely the biggest or most obviously powerful object in the room. It is usually something smaller, something given rather than forged, something that only works because somebody meant it sincerely when they gave it. At the close of Mortal Recoil, in one final quiet image, the show reveals where the Lich's spirit has gone to hide, back into the snail. The camera holds on the waving snail, as fans had taken to calling it, its eyes now sunken, dark, filled with a faint green light that was not there before, waving its small antennae at the audience with what reads, in retrospect, as something close to a threat, disguised as a friendly gesture. For the next 2 full seasons, the snail continues appearing in the background of nearly every episode, exactly as it always had, except now every single appearance carries a quiet, unspoken dread that the show never once comments on directly. He is there. He is always there. He is small and slow and completely unthreatening to look at, and he is patiently, silently waiting for his next opportunity. Because patience, more than fire or fear or even the desire for death itself, may be the single most defining trait this character possesses. He has more time than anyone he is fighting. He has always had more time than anyone he is fighting. Eventually, that math tends to work in his favor. It worked in his favor again roughly 2 seasons later, in an episode simply titled The Lich, which functions as the 4th season finale and marks the moment the character graduates from recurring background threat to something closer to the architect of the show's entire cosmic mythology going forward. By this point, the Lich has abandoned the snail and taken a far more disturbing vessel, the corpse of Billy himself, the legendary hero who defeated him in the first place, now long dead, his body worn by the Lich like a disguise, like a coat taken from someone who no longer needs it. The show does not reveal this immediately. For most of the episode, Finn and Jake believe they are genuinely reuniting with their childhood hero, a figure they have idolized since the very first season, and the emotional register of those early scenes is warm, almost reverent, the two of them practically vibrating with excitement at getting to adventure alongside the man whose legend shaped their entire understanding of what heroism should look like. The Lich, wearing Billy's face, plays this completely straight. He manipulates them with patience and precision, guiding them toward gathering a series of magical gems embedded in the crowns of several of Oo's princesses, ostensibly for some noble purpose Billy is supposedly pursuing. The reveal, when it comes, is delivered with a single visual gesture that critics and fans alike still cite as one of the show's most effective horror beats. Half of Billy's face tears away, and underneath is not injury, not blood, not the aftermath of some accident. Underneath is the Lich's own skull, grinning, having been there the entire time, hidden just beneath a thin and increasingly unstable layer of borrowed flesh. Everything Finn and Jake believed about the adventure they were on collapses in that single instant, and the show does not soften the horror of it for its young audience. It simply lets the moment land and moves forward. Jake, understanding what has actually been happening, tries to physically hold onto the Lich as he moves toward a portal the boys had unknowingly helped construct, using the shattered remains of a book called the Enchiridion, once considered indestructible, now broken open specifically because that was always the Lich's plan. Finn holds on to Jake. All three of them, Hero's corpse and terrified boy and his adopted brother, get pulled through together. On the other side is a place outside of ordinary reality entirely, a location the show calls the Time Room, home to an entity named Prismo, who exists adjacent to every timeline simultaneously, rather than inside any single one of them, and who possesses the ability to grant wishes, though, in the tradition of every story that has ever featured a wish-granting figure. Those wishes get fulfilled with a literalism that rarely matches what the wisher actually meant. Finn and Jake arrive just in time to watch the Lich vanish after making his own wish. One final, singular request delivered with what witnesses describe as triumphant, almost gleeful satisfaction: the extinction of all life, everywhere, permanently. It is granted. The Lich disappears, laughing. Prismo, in the understated, almost bureaucratic tone the show gives him throughout his appearances, offers Finn and Jake one detail that recontextualizes everything that just happened, delivered so casually. It almost slips past unnoticed the first time you watch it. What they had been traveling with, adventuring alongside, trusting, was, in Prismo's exact words, a ghost wearing a dead guy. Billy really is dead, has been dead for some time, in fact, killed by the very entity he supposedly defeated decades earlier, his body kept as a disguise, a costume for a consciousness that does not particularly need flesh to function, but finds flesh useful when flesh gets things done. Finn, still a child by any reasonable measure, absorbs this information standing in a room outside of time itself, having just watched his childhood hero's face tear open to reveal something that has been quietly hunting him for longer than he has been alive. Given a single wish of his own to try to fix what has just happened, Finn does what almost anyone might do in his position. He reaches for the biggest, most sweeping correction he can imagine. He wishes that the Lich had never existed, not simply defeated, not simply banished, erased from having ever been a part of the world's history at all, retroactively, completely. This is where the story splits, and where the show did something genuinely rare for children's animation, which was to take a wish this large and this well-intentioned and follow its consequences all the way down to their logical, uncomfortable conclusion. Finn is instantly transported into an alternate version of reality built entirely from the shape of his own wish, a world the fandom took to calling Farm World, structured around the premise that if the Lich never existed, the entire chain of events, his existence set in motion, would have to unravel as well. And the show is very specific and very careful about what that unraveling actually looks like, because it is not simply a better world. It is a different world, built on a different set of losses. In Farm World, the Mushroom War either never happened in the same catastrophic way or was interrupted before it could finish, because it was the Lich's emergence from the detonation of the mutagenic bomb that gave the war its full, world-ending significance in the timeline we already know. Without the Lich waiting to be born from that specific catastrophe, Simon Petrikov, in this alternate version of events, makes a different choice than the one his primary timeline counterpart made. Rather than surviving the war and slowly losing himself to the crown across 1,000 subsequent years, Farmworld Simon throws himself directly beneath the falling bomb, using the crown's power in one final, desperate act to physically stop the detonation. He succeeds, and he dies doing it. The crown, its intended wearer gone and its purpose unresolved, does not simply deactivate. It rages, unmoored, and the resulting magical catastrophe covers much of the surviving world in an ice age instead. Marceline in this timeline is shown briefly as a skeleton, an implication the show never fully explains but never softens either. Everyone still loses something. The specific shape of the loss simply changes. Finn arriving into this alternate world as its own version of Finn, a human farm boy who has never had any of the adventures that define the Finn we know, eventually finds his way to the same crown, tries it on to solve an immediate, mundane problem involving his family's debts, and is corrupted by it almost instantly, far faster than either Simon or Gunter before him. In part, the show suggests because Farmworld's Finn accepts the crown's power willingly and eagerly, rather than resisting it the way Simon fought against it for as long as he could. He becomes dangerous. He hurts people trying to protect them. He accidentally triggers the very bomb his alternate timeline predecessor died stopping, and in the chaos, Farmworld's version of Jake, Finn's ordinary, non-magical dog, falls into the resulting pool of mutagenic residue and begins transforming, growing, twisting into something that increasingly resembles the Lich himself, not possessed by him exactly, but built from the same raw material, shaped by the same catastrophic ingredients into a similar silhouette. There is a small specific detail buried in this transformation that fan analysis of the episode has pointed to as evidence for how the show actually understands the Lich's fundamental nature, and I think it is worth including here, clearly labeled as interpretation rather than stated fact, because it changes how you might read everything else. Farmworld Jake, once transformed by contact with the mutagenic pool, does not fight using magic, does not summon fire from bone the way the true Lich does. He attacks with nothing but his bare hands, an ordinary, physical kind of violence rather than a cosmic one. The same appears to hold true, according to some readings of the mythology, for Billy's corpse once it becomes the Lich's disguise, where the entity's borrowed power seems to draw at least partly from whatever the host body itself was already capable of, rather than importing some fixed, unchanging arsenal wholesale into every vessel he occupies. If that reading holds, then the Lich is not simply a fixed, unchanging monster who happens to wear different masks. He is something closer to a principle that expresses itself differently depending on what material it has been given to work with. Monstrous in a snail, the way a snail is monstrous. Monstrous in a dead hero, the way that hero's own former strength might have been monstrous if turned toward the wrong purpose. Monstrous in a farm dog, the way a dog's simple physical aggression becomes monstrous once stripped of anything gentle to balance it. The end he wants never changes. The shape he takes on the way there always does. Back in the time room, the real Jake watches all of this unfold on what amounts to a television screen Prismo has set up for the occasion, and the show extracts a genuinely strange, almost uncomfortable comedy from the contrast. Jake initially far more interested in getting a sandwich out of his own wish than in grasping the scale of what is happening to his best friend. Prismo gently, repeatedly, redirecting him toward the gravity of the situation. It is only when Jake actually witnesses his own farm-world counterpart transforming into something monstrous, watches it happen in real time on the screen, that the stakes finally register for him completely, and by then there is barely a moment left to act. What Jake does with his wish is the detail worth sitting with longest, because it reveals something quietly important about how this show thinks about wishes, and maybe about how it thinks about undoing damage in general. He does not ask to fix Farm World. He does not ask to bring back what was lost there, or to somehow prevent the Lich from ever existing more successfully than Finn's original wish managed to. He simply wishes for Finn to be safe, and when even that phrasing produces uncertainty and risk, Prismo, following the same rules of literal wish fulfillment that govern every wish in this mythology, ultimately grants a version of the request that returns both boys home safely to the actual timeline, the one where the Lich did exist, where the war did happen the way it happened, where Simon did become the Ice King and lost 1,000 years, and Marceline did survive alone in the ruins. Jake's wish does not erase anything. It simply and only brings his friend back. And here is the detail the show plants and never fully unpacks. The one thread of implication that the story leaves for you to notice on your own if you happen to be paying close enough attention. Prismo observes, almost as an aside, that even the Lich's own wish, the one he made moments before vanishing, the wish for the extinction of all life everywhere, ultimately produced an outcome the Lich himself could not have anticipated or wanted. Finn and Jake, safe, returned home, the universe he wished to end instead quietly, mundanely continuing on exactly as it had before, entirely unaffected by his triumph. The most powerful wish anyone in this mythology ever makes, an actual request for total annihilation, granted in full, changes essentially nothing in the world that actually matters to the story. That is either an enormous cosmic joke at the Lich's expense, or it is the show's quietest possible argument about the difference between having power and having consequence. And Adventure Time, characteristically, never tells you which one it means you to take away. Both readings sit there, available, unresolved, the way most of this show's deepest ideas tend to sit. This is a good place to go back further, all the way back, past the war, past Billy, past every human century whose ruins Finn and Jake have ever picked through, because the Farm World story only makes emotional sense once you understand exactly where the Lich came from in the first place, and the show's answer to that question turns out to be one of the strangest, most genuinely alien pieces of world building any children's cartoon has ever attempted. According to the mythology, the show slowly assembled across multiple seasons, much of it delivered obliquely through a character called the Purple Comet in a later episode simply titled The Comet, the Lich's essence, whatever essence means for a being like this, was not born on Earth at all. It was carried here, deposited by what the show calls a catalyst comet, a specific kind of cosmic object that appears to function less like an ordinary asteroid and more like a vessel, something that transports a particular force or entity or principle from wherever it originated and delivers it into a new world, where it can then choose, in some sense, the show never fully clarifies, to be born. This same catalyst comet mythology is later used to explain Finn's own existence, which we will return to, but the first and oldest confirmed catalyst comet in the show's history is the green one, and its arrival on Earth is tied, by strong and repeated implication across multiple episodes, to one of the most significant extinction events in the actual scientific history of our own planet, the asteroid impact that ended the age of the dinosaurs. I want to be careful and precise here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that deserves a clear label rather than a confident assertion. The show never states outright, in so many words, in a single line of unambiguous dialogue, that the comet responsible for killing the dinosaurs is definitively and exclusively the same comet that later became the Lich. What the show does is stack up a series of strong, deliberate, and repeated visual and narrative implications. A green, horned comet appears in the prehistoric set episode Evergreen, coloring and shape matching descriptions given elsewhere of the Lich's original cosmic form. That same episode is explicitly set during the age of dinosaurs and ends with the implication that the comet's arrival caused their extinction, and later episodes describe the Lich's essence as having arrived on Earth millions of years before the events of the show via a catalyst comet, language that multiple secondary sources treating the show's mythology, including its own Wikipedia entry, describe as tied directly to the KPG extinction event. Taken together, this reads less like ambiguity for ambiguity's sake and more like a puzzle the show wanted patient viewers to solve for themselves, arriving at a conclusion the writers believed, but chose never to simply hand over in a single tidy sentence. I am treating it, for the purposes of tonight, as strongly implied and very likely intended, while being honest that it is not stated with total, unambiguous finality on screen. That distinction matters, and I want to honor it, rather than pretend to a certainty the show itself never quite offers. What the episode Evergreen does state clearly, without any ambiguity at all, is a separate but entangled piece of mythology, the origin of the Ice King's crown. Set during the Cretaceous period, tens of millions of years before any human being would ever walk the Earth, the episode follows an ice elemental named Urgence Evergreen, one of 4 elemental beings governing ice, fire, candy, and slime respectively during this ancient era, as he grows increasingly alarmed by the approach of a comet he describes against the skepticism of his fellow elementals, as carrying genuine, deliberate, malicious intent rather than simply being a natural part of the world's ordinary cycle of destruction and renewal. The other elementals dismiss his concern. Evergreen does not. He determines that the only way to stop the comet is to build a crown, a magical artifact capable of granting the deepest wish of whoever wears it, intending to wear it himself and use its power to destroy the incoming threat before it can reach the Earth. He is not gentle in pursuit of this goal. He freezes his fellow elementals when they refuse to help him. He takes his young apprentice, a mutated theropod dinosaur named Gunther, whom several accounts of the episode describe as having been raised more like a servant than a student, on a dangerous expedition to harvest the enchanted ruby eyes of an ancient creature called magwood, the specific components the crown's construction requires. He builds the crown with a bonding spell woven into it, designed so that the mind and desire of its first wearer would be permanently imprinted into the artifact itself, a detail that will matter enormously in a moment. And then, at the worst possible instant, with the comet's arrival imminent and the crown finally complete, Magwood returns for revenge, and in the resulting fight, Evergreen is pinned beneath collapsing ice, unable to reach the crown himself. He orders Gunther to put it on in his place, to wish the comet away. What happens next is the tragedy the entire episode has been quietly building toward, and it is worth sitting with the specific mechanics of it, because they explain something that would otherwise remain permanently mysterious about the Ice King 1,000 years later. The crown does not simply grant whatever wish its wearer consciously states out loud. It grants the wearer's deepest, truest desire, whatever that actually turns out to be. And Gunther despite believing he wants to save the world exactly as instructed, has spent the entire episode revealing, through small gestures and constant, uncomplicated devotion, that his real deepest wish, the thing sitting underneath every other thought he has ever had, is simply to be like Evergreen, not to defeat a comet, to be his master. When the crown activates, it does not stop the disaster at all. It transforms Gunther, warping his small dinosaur body into a twisted, magically distorted approximation of Evergreen himself, blue-skinned, white-haired, long-nosed, and it strips away his sanity in the process, leaving him able to say only two words, repeated over and over in mounting horror as he realizes what is happening to him. Gunther, no, Evergreen, trapped and helpless, tries to shout a counterspell that might undo the transformation and realizes, in the same moment of dawning catastrophe that so many of this show's tragedies seem to hinge on, that he never actually taught his apprentice any spells at all. There is nothing Gunther can do to stop what is happening, because nobody ever gave him the tools to stop anything. The comet is not destroyed. Evergreen is killed. The dinosaurs, whatever additional catastrophe the comet's continued, unimpeded arrival caused, go extinct, and the crown remains. Millions of years pass. It sits somewhere on Earth, inert, waiting, carrying inside it the imprint of a small, frightened dinosaur's single overwhelming wish, until eventually, in the 20th or 20th century of what was then modern human civilization, a dock worker in northern Scandinavia finds it and sells it to an antiquarian named Simon Petrikov, a man who buys it the way he buys everything, out of professional curiosity, with every intention of studying it properly once he gets it home. He puts it on his head, possibly to make his fiancée Betty laugh, and the crown, running the exact same program it has been running since the day Gunther first activated it, does to Simon precisely what it did to that small, terrified dinosaur so many millions of years earlier. It does not care that Simon's own deepest wish is almost certainly something entirely different from Gunther's. That is the specific horror of the bonding spell Evergreen wove into the artifact. Only the first wearer's desire actually matters. Every subsequent wearer simply inherits the shape of that original wish, forced through it like water through a mold that was never built with them in mind. Simon becomes something like Evergreen because Gunther wanted, more than anything else, in his short and mistreated life, to become Evergreen. The Ice King's obsessive, repeated use of the name Gunther for every penguin he ever meets, a detail the show plays for gentle comedy across dozens of episodes, is, in this light, something closer to a scar the crown itself carries forward through every wearer it ever claims. An echo of the original desire still running somewhere underneath 1,000 years of subsequent madness. He does not remember Gunther. He could not possibly remember Gunther. But something in the crown remembers, and it keeps saying the name anyway. I want to be honest about where the show leaves the exact relationship between this story and the Lich's own origin, because it is genuinely, deliberately unresolved. The Crown's mythology and the Lich's mythology both trace back to the same prehistoric moment, the same approaching green comet, the same age of dinosaurs. Whether the comet Evergreen tried and failed to stop is literally precisely the same catalyst comet that would later, elsewhere, deposit whatever became the Lich, or whether they are two closely related but ultimately separate cosmic events that the show simply chose to place side by side because the thematic resonance mattered more to the writers than strict continuity, is something I genuinely cannot tell you with full certainty, and neither, as far as I can find, can anyone else who has spent serious time picking through this mythology. What I can tell you with confidence is what the show is clearly, unmistakably interested in, regardless of how literally connected the two threads actually are. The idea that the oldest, most dangerous forces in this entire world, the Crown and the Lich alike, trace back to the exact same ancient catastrophe, a green light in the Cretaceous sky that ended one age of the world and left behind two separate curses for whichever species happened to inherit the wreckage afterward. Whether that is one story or two stories wearing the same color, the meaning underneath it stays essentially the same either way. Some kinds of damage are simply older than anyone currently alive, and they do not go away just because the people who caused them are already millions of years dead. 65 million years, by the show's own internal accounting, is roughly how long that damage sat, waiting before its next major reactivation, which arrived, at last, at the end of the Mushroom War. We have covered the broad shape of the Mushroom War already in other conversations on this channel: the mutagenic bomb, the businessmen frozen in ice, the scar still visible on the map of Ooh 1,000 years later. What we have not fully sat with is the specific, deliberate role the Lich plays in that catastrophe's final moments, because the show is careful, almost surgical, about the order in which it reveals this information. The Lich does not cause the Mushroom War. That distinction matters, and the show goes out of its way to preserve it. Humanity built its own bombs, ran its own arms race, made its own decisions, all the way to the edge, and then passed it, entirely without cosmic interference. What the Lich does is arrive at the exact moment the worst of those decisions finally detonates, using the catastrophe as a door rather than a cause. His essence, deposited on Earth millions of years earlier by that ancient comet, and dormant ever since, waiting with the same patience he would later demonstrate as a snail, riding quietly through 2 full seasons of somebody else's cartoon, finally finds physical form near the very end of the war, when the specific mutagenic bomb detonates, and someone, some unnamed, unremembered person who happened to be standing in or near the resulting toxic waste, becomes the vessel he needed. He possesses that person, or perhaps more accurately, he simply becomes that person, reshapes them entirely into the skeletal, crowned figure Finn and Jake would eventually learn to fear, and the worst thing humanity ever did to itself becomes, simultaneously and inseparably, the thing that finally gave its oldest enemy a body to walk around in. That detail, more than almost any other piece of this mythology, is the one worth sitting with in silence for a moment, because it collapses 2 ideas that most stories keep carefully separate. Human self-destruction and cosmic evil are not, in this particular mythology, 2 different forces that happen to arrive at the same catastrophe from different directions. They are the same event, viewed from 2 different angles. The bomb was entirely, completely a human choice, built by human hands for human reasons, that had nothing whatsoever to do with ancient comets or dinosaurs or ice elementals. And the bomb was also, simultaneously, the specific mechanism an entity older than the universe had been patiently waiting to use for 65 million years. Both of those things are true at once, and the show never asks you to pick between them, the same way it never asks you to pick between the candy and the ruins, the warmth and the grief, the funny episode and the genuinely terrifying speech buried somewhere inside it. From there, the timeline the show has already established elsewhere clicks into place with grim precision. The Lich, newly embodied, spend some unknown stretch of years, possibly decades, possibly longer, attempting exactly what Princess Bubblegum would later describe finding evidence of, converting the planet's remaining life force into unholy power, working toward the same singular purpose he would openly declare to Finn and Jake 1,000 years later, the extinction of everything. He is eventually defeated, decisively enough that the show treats it as legendary rather than merely successful, by Billy, whose reputation as Oo's greatest hero appears to rest substantially, though not entirely, on this single achievement. Billy seals him in amber, buries him in the tree that would eventually become the literal foundation of Princess Bubblegum's palace, and there is something worth noticing in that architectural choice too, whether the show intended it as pointed as it reads or not. The Candy Kingdom, sweet and bright and organized entirely around Bubblegum's tireless competence, is built directly on top of its own oldest nightmare. Every scene set in that palace, for the entire run of the show, takes place a few hundred feet above a sleeping cosmic entity that once tried to end all life on Earth. Nobody in the Candy Kingdom thinks about this constantly, presumably the same way nobody thinks constantly about what is buried underneath any old, comfortable building they happen to live in. But it is there. It was always there. And for 2 full seasons, it was still there, quietly listening inside a snail nobody was paying attention to. The story does not end with the snail, or with Billy's corpse, or even with the wish that briefly split reality in two. It goes one layer deeper still, into an arc that many longtime viewers consider among the show's most genuinely disturbing stretches of storytelling, beginning with an episode titled Wake Up and its direct continuation, Escape from the Citadel. By this point in the show's run, having been defeated in physical form, having lost his disguise as Billy, having been pulled through a dimensional portal alongside Finn and Jake into Prismo's time room, the Lich's spirit remains loose, unaccounted for. A loaded gun the story had set down without ever fully picking back up. The resolution, when it arrives, comes almost sideways. Prismo, it turns out, has his own vulnerabilities, his own mortal avatar that can, under specific and unlikely circumstances, actually be killed, which would trigger a kind of cosmic bureaucratic consequence involving a prison called the Citadel, reserved specifically for beings who have committed what the show calls cosmic crimes, offenses too large or too strange for any ordinary system of justice to process. In the process of investigating something unrelated to the Lich directly, Finn and Jake inadvertently threaten Prismo's mortal form, and that threat, that brush with genuine mortal danger, is enough to stir the Lich's spirit awake from wherever it had been drifting since Farm World. He does not hesitate. He kills Prismo fully and without theatrics, an act the show treats with real gravity given how much affection the character had built up across his prior appearances, and for that single act, an entity older than the universe itself is finally, formally arrested and delivered to the Citadel. What follows inside that prison, once the Lich arrives there, deepens the mythology in a direction the show had never previously suggested. Using the same corrosive, decaying substance he had used to kill Prismo, the Lich melts through the crystal confines, holding the prison's other inmates, freeing an unknown number of ancient, dangerous beings in the process, entities the show refers to, in one telling later line of dialogue, as ancients, language that strongly suggests, though does not definitively confirm, some kinship or shared origin with the primordial monsters we will get to shortly. This is a being who does not need allies in any conventional sense, who has spent his entire recorded existence pursuing a singular, uncomplicated goal without any apparent need for company along the way. And yet, given the opportunity, he chooses to unleash chaos on a truly massive scale rather than simply escaping quietly on his own. Whether that reflects genuine strategy, an attempt to overwhelm his captors with sheer numbers, or something closer to simple, indiscriminate malice, the show leaves for you to decide. He does not, in the end, escape as himself. In the chaos of the Citadel's collapse, a being called the Citadel Guardian, whose healing blood carries transformative properties, ends up affecting the Lich directly, and the result is the single, strangest, most genuinely unexpected twist his entire story ever takes. The oldest, most singularly destructive entity the show had built across 5 full seasons of mythology is transformed by that healing blood into a harmless infant, not weakened, not sealed away again, turned completely and apparently sincerely into a baby, discovered shortly afterward by 2 of the show's most consistently gentle recurring characters, the elderly elephant Tree Trunks and her husband Mr. Pig, who adopt him without any idea what they are actually bringing into their home and name him with the same warmth they extend to everything, Sweet Pig Trunks, Sweet Pea for short. Sit with the scale of that transformation for a moment, because the show clearly wants you to. The being who possessed a person out of mutagenic waste at the end of a war that killed most of a civilization, who tried to end all life on Earth once already, who murdered his own hero and wore his corpse like a coat, who killed a wish-granting cosmic entity without hesitation. The instant that entity became a genuine inconvenience, is now living in a small house at the edge of an apple orchard, being sung to sleep, having his diaper changed, growing up, gradually, inside a family that has absolutely no reason to suspect what they are actually raising. For a stretch of episodes, the show simply lets this sit, lets Sweet Pea exist as a genuinely, uncomplicatedly sweet child, sensitive and kind, the kind of kid who cries easily and comforts injured animals without a second thought. And then, gradually, carefully, it starts letting the seams show. The episode Gold Stars, which aired in the show's 6th season, is where those seams finally split all the way open, and it remains, by the near universal agreement of critics who reviewed it at the time, one of the most quietly terrifying pieces of storytelling the show ever produced, precisely because of how ordinary the episode is for most of its runtime before that terror arrives. Sweet Pea, now old enough to attend school for the first time, is befriended by 2 manipulative con artists, the returning villain known as the King of Ooh and his associate Toronto, who use the boy as an unwitting distraction for their thefts, while rewarding him with small gold stars that his adoptive parents proudly display on their refrigerator, unaware of the exploitation happening just outside their view. It is, up to a certain point, a fairly straightforward morality tale about trusting strangers, competently made, but not especially remarkable by the standards this show usually holds itself to. And then the King of Ooh and Toronto, cornered and desperate, threaten to burn down Tree Trunks' orchard, the home Sweet Pea has known his entire short life, unless he agrees to abandon his family and dance for them forever, calling him, in their cruelty, a baby man, the exact kind of dismissive schoolyard insult that had already wounded him earlier that same day. Something in that specific combination, the direct threat to the people he loves, paired with the exact wound already sitting raw from earlier, reaches all the way down to whatever is still sleeping inside him, and it wakes up. The transition the show gives this moment is deliberately, carefully abrupt. The warm pastel backdrop of the orchard disappears entirely, replaced by total darkness, and the voice that comes out of Sweet Pea's mouth is no longer the small, gentle voice of a child actor, but Ron Perlman's layered directly over it, two performances occupying the same body at once, in a way multiple reviewers at the time described as genuinely chilling rather than merely unsettling. Stop, the voice says. I have learned much from you. Thank you, my teachers. And now for your education. What follows is the single most direct cosmological statement the entire series ever makes, delivered not through some detached narrator or expository text crawl, but through the mouth of a small, sweet child possessed, however briefly, by the oldest thing in his own body. Before there was time, before there was anything, there was nothing. And before there was nothing, there were monsters. The visuals that accompany this line show exactly what that claim looks like made physical. A churning, writhing sea of enormous golden-toned creatures, later identified across the show's own supplementary materials as the primordial monsters, existing by the show's own internal logic, before the nothingness that supposedly preceded even the Big Bang itself. This is not a metaphor the show is offering. It is presented flatly, without decoration or narrative hedging, as simply a true fact about the deep structure of this universe, delivered with the same matter-of-fact confidence the show usually reserves for far smaller revelations. King of Ooh and Toronto are shown these monsters directly, forced to witness something no mortal being should probably ever have to witness, and the terror the show gives them is total and immediate, stripped of any of the comedic cushioning that usually accompanies even the show's darker moments. Here's your gold star, the Lich says, and black smoke pours from Sweet Pea's small mouth, and the two men flee the orchard screaming, and by morning, Sweet Pea remembers none of it, dismisses the entire episode as just a dream, the same phrase, notably, that he had used earlier in the episode after a different, smaller glimpse of his own darker nature. What Gold Stars confirms, without any remaining ambiguity, is that the transformation into Sweet Pea did not erase the Lich. It contained him, the way Amber once contained him, the way a snail's small, unremarkable body once contained him. One more vessel in a sequence of vessels stretching back 65 million years, and every previous vessel eventually cracked open when the pressure grew sufficient. There is no reason given, at this point in the show, to believe Sweet Pea's vessel is any more permanent than the others were. I want to pause here and take the show's own cosmological claim seriously for a moment, rather than simply cataloging it as one more piece of world-building trivia, because I think it deserves more weight than that. Before there was nothing, there were monsters. That is a genuinely strange thing for a children's cartoon to assert about the structure of its own universe, and it is worth noticing what it actually implies if you take it at face value the way the show clearly wants you to. Most creation myths, across most human cultures, tend to place some kind of order, some divine or natural principle, at the very beginning of things, with chaos and monstrosity arriving later as a corruption or a fall from an original, better state. Adventure Time inverts that structure completely. In its mythology, monstrosity is not a corruption of some earlier, purer order. Monstrosity is the actual bedrock, the thing that existed before nothingness itself, and order, time, the universe as we understand it, the whole apparatus of cause and effect and growth and story, arrived later, built, in some sense, the show never fully explains, on top of, or perhaps out of, that original chaos. The Lich, then, is not really a villain who emerged within this universe to threaten it from the outside. He is a survivor of whatever came before the universe existed at all, a remnant of the actual foundation everything else was eventually built over, still present, still functioning according to whatever logic governed that older, darker state of existence, patiently waiting for the newer, more fragile order built on top of him to finally collapse back into what it originally came from. Speculation on my part, admittedly, reading intent into a show that famously prefers implication to explanation, but it is speculation the text itself invites rather than one I am simply imposing on it from outside. It helps, before going further, to notice that the Lich is not actually the only ancient, cosmic being the show reveals to have been hiding in plain sight all along, disguised as something small and unthreatening for far longer than anyone around him ever suspected. The Ice King, across the entire run of the show, keeps a large number of pet penguins and refers to every single one of them by the same name, Gunter, a detail, the crown's inherited memory of the original dinosaur apprentice helps explain, as we have already discussed. But one particular Gunter, ordinary and unremarkable in every visible way for season after season, is eventually revealed to be something else entirely. An ancient cosmic entity called Orgalorg, known elsewhere in the universe as the Breaker of Worlds, an enormous and genuinely dangerous being who had once tried to absorb the power of a catalyst comet for himself long before recorded history began, and who was defeated in that attempt by intervention, traced back to a four-faced deity, and, by some accounts, to a version of Abraham Lincoln ruling as King of Mars, a detail the show delivers with such straight-faced confidence that it becomes almost funnier for never once winking at how strange it sounds. Orgalorg fell to Earth afterward, compressed by the planet's gravity down into a small, harmless penguin form, and forgot everything he had ever been, wandering the world for centuries with no memory of his own former scale, until he eventually stumbled into the Ice King's orbit and was simply adopted, one more penguin among many, one more small, unremarkable body carrying something enormous and forgotten underneath its feathers. The show never draws a direct causal line between Orgalorg and the Lich, and I want to be careful not to manufacture one where the text itself stays quiet. They do not appear to be the same kind of being, and nothing in the material suggests Orgalorg shares the Lich's specific devotion to Golb or his singular focus on universal extinction. But placing the two side by side tells you something about the pattern this show kept returning to across its entire run, almost as though the writers found the idea itself endlessly productive, something ancient and overwhelming, reduced by circumstance to something small and ordinary, hiding for years inside a body nobody thinks twice about, waiting, whether consciously or not, longs for a reason to remember what it used to be. Orgalorg's story ends gently, even sweetly, when the crown eventually grants him his own deepest wish in the finale's aftermath, which turns out to be simply the desire to be like the one being who was kind to him during all those forgotten, wandering years, and the universe, for once, just lets him have it. The Lich's story never resolves nearly so gently, and it is worth sitting with why that might be. Orgalorg's deepest nature, whatever it once was, apparently still had room in it for a wish this small and this warm. Whether the Lich's ever did, or whether devotion to Golb has simply eaten every other possible desire he might once have carried, is a question the show raises and then declines, characteristically, to answer for you. This cosmology gains one more crucial layer of context in the later episode, The Comet, which introduces the mythology of catalyst comets as a broader, recurring phenomenon rather than a single unique event confined to the Lich's own origin story. According to the Purple Comet's own account, given directly within that episode, catalyst comets carry within them a specific force or essence, something the show treats as almost a kind of soul that has, in some meaningful sense, chosen to be born into the world it arrives in. The Lich's green comet is one such arrival, but he is not the only one. Finn himself, the show reveals, is another, tied to a blue catalyst comet representing, in direct and pointed opposition to everything the Lich embodies, the specific cosmic principle of heroism, of choosing to act with goodness rather than simply existing indifferently. The universe, by this accounting, did not produce Finn by accident, the same way it did not produce the Lich by accident. It produced both of them as matched opposites, two forces cycling through history in different forms across different eras, one oriented entirely toward ending things and one oriented entirely toward protecting them, locked in a kind of cosmic rotation that long predates either of their current specific incarnations. There is real weight in recognizing what this means for how you understand Finn's decency throughout the entire rest of the show. It is not simply his upbringing, his personality, a series of individual choices he happens to keep making correctly. It is something older than his individual life, something the universe itself, by its own internal logic, deliberately arranged to exist in permanent tension with whatever the Lich represents. Every time Finn chooses to help someone at personal cost, every time he refuses to give up on a fight he could easily walk away from, he is not simply behaving well. He is, in some sense, the show only ever implies, and never states outright, fulfilling a cosmic function that has been running since before recorded history, the specific and necessary counterweight to a force that has also been running since before recorded history, arriving now, in this particular story, wearing the shape of a boy and his dog rather than whatever earlier shape it might have worn in whatever earlier era needed it. This is also where the mythology takes its final, strangest turn, moving out of the original 9-season series entirely and into the spin-off show Adventure Time, Fiona and Cake, which continues the story roughly 1,000 years after the events of the main series finale. I want to be clear about the boundary here, because it matters for how confidently I can speak about what follows. Everything up to this point comes from the primary series, treated by the show's own internal chronology as settled, canonical history. What comes next comes from a different, later production made by different hands years afterward. And while Adventure Time, Fiona and Cake positions itself as a direct continuation of the same universe, rather than a separate reimagining, it is worth holding these final details a little more loosely as the newest and least battle-tested layer of a mythology that has otherwise had over a decade to settle into place. In an episode of that spin-off titled Casper and Nova, part of a 2-episode stretch that also includes an episode called Jerry, we get the single most direct statement the franchise has ever offered about what actually motivates the Lich. Underneath every specific act of destruction he has ever attempted, he refers to himself in this material as the last scholar of Golb, invoking a name that had already been quietly seeded into the main series years earlier without ever being fully explained, an entity representing chaos itself. In roughly the same totalizing way, the Lich represents inevitable death. And the show reveals, through this framing that the Lich's entire campaign of destruction across every era we have discussed tonight, the war he waited 65 million years to exploit, the hero he murdered and wore like a disguise, the wish granter he killed without hesitation, was never simply an expression of pure, undirected malice. It was devotion. He believed, apparently with total sincerity, that achieving the extinction of all life everywhere would function as an offering, a form of worship directed toward Gulb, the being he considered himself scholar and servant to. This reframing matters enormously, and I think it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. A villain who simply wants destruction for its own sake is, in narrative terms, relatively simple to understand, and ultimately somewhat limited as an idea. A being who commits himself entirely to what he believes is a form of devotion, who understands his own campaign of annihilation not as cruelty, but as something closer to religious practice, is a genuinely more unsettling and more honest reflection of how the worst things human beings actually do tend to get justified in the minds of the people doing them. The most dangerous things in this world, the show seems to be arguing here, are rarely committed by beings who understand themselves as simply evil. They are committed by beings or people who have convinced themselves they are serving something larger and more important than any individual life standing in the way. The material in Casper and Nova and Jerry adds one more genuinely strange wrinkle to this picture, and it involves an alternate version of the Lich existing in a separate reality entirely, one where, unlike in our primary timeline, he actually succeeded completely, wiping out every form of life across that entire alternate world. And the show's treatment of that victorious version of him is, perhaps, the single most quietly devastating thing it has ever done with this character. Having achieved, totally and permanently, the one goal he has pursued across 65 million years and multiple bodies and every previous defeat, this version of the Lich does not celebrate. He becomes, by the show's own description, depressed, sitting in isolation in a world containing nothing left to destroy, his entire purpose complete and therefore somehow gone. The only remaining form of life in that particular dead world turns out to be Bimo, the small, gentle robot from the primary timeline, who ends up trapped there through circumstances unrelated to the Lich directly, and who, in an act of characteristic and genuinely strange tenderness, gives this ancient, victorious entity of total annihilation a name, Jerry, just Jerry, delivered with the same easy warmth BMO extends to essentially everything it encounters, and the Lich, having spent unknowable stretches of time alone with absolutely nothing left in the universe to talk to, it appears to accept it. I want to be honest about how strange and how genuinely moving I find this particular piece of the mythology, speculative as its ultimate meaning remains, an entity that exists, by its own account, as the manifestation of inevitable death that has spent every recorded moment of its existence pursuing total extinction with what the show has always framed as machine-like, purpose-driven focus, achieves that exact goal completely and discovers, on the other side of total victory, not triumph, but a kind of bottomless, purposeless grief. Simon Petrikov, encountering this depressed, victorious Lich much later in the same storyline, reportedly tries briefly to empathize with him, recognizing something in the Lich's loss of purpose that echoes his own long, complicated experience of losing everything that once gave his life shape and meaning. The Lich, according to the material describing this scene, does not respond to that attempt at empathy at all. Whatever capacity for connection Simon is reaching toward if the Lich ever possessed anything like it, does not appear to be accessible to him even now, even here, even alone with nothing left in the universe but his own unbearable, accidental company. That is, I think, as close as this entire mythology ever comes to offering something like a thesis statement about what the Lich actually represents underneath every specific plot mechanism the show ever built around him. He is not simply death. He is what death looks like if it ever actually finished its job completely, and what it would discover, having finished, is that there was never anything waiting for it on the other side of finishing. No triumph, no rest, no meaning generated by the completion of the task, because the task itself, total and permanent ending, turns out to eliminate the very context in which triumph or rest or meaning could exist for anyone, including the entity that achieved it. Adventure Time built an entire mythology around a force whose deepest, truest nature turns out to be a kind of eternal, unresolvable loneliness, worse in some ways than anything Marceline or Simon or Princess Bubblegum ever carried, because at least their loneliness existed within a world that still contained other people worth missing. Which brings us, finally, back to the main series' own ending, and to the strange, muted role the Lich plays in it, a role defined almost entirely by absence rather than presence. The series finale, a feature-length event broken into 4 connected parts and titled Come Along With Me, builds across its runtime toward what audiences had spent years anticipating would be its central conflict: the Great Gum War, a long simmering family feud between Princess Bubblegum and her estranged relatives, finally erupting into open combat. That conflict does happen, and it does matter, but the show pulls its most significant twist by revealing, midway through the finale, that the war audiences had been promised was never actually the real threat waiting at the end of this story. As the battle reaches its height, the sky itself opens, and Golb arrives. The chaos entity, the Lich, had spent an unknown stretch of his existence devoting himself to as scholar and servant, finally manifesting directly in U for the first and only time across the entire main series. The Lich himself, notably, does not appear in this climactic confrontation, at least not in the active, embodied form that had driven so much of the show's earlier mythology. He remains, as he has since the events of Escape from the Citadel, dormant inside Sweet Pea, who is present in the finale's broader cast but who does not, at any point during Golb's arrival, transform or reawaken or take any active role in the battle against the very entity he once claimed to serve. This absence feels, on reflection, entirely intentional rather than accidental. The story the show wanted to tell in its final hours was not, in the end, primarily a story about defeating the Lich directly. It was a story about Betty Groff, Simon's fiancée, having traveled forward through 1,000 years of time specifically to save him, using a summoning ritual that goes wrong in several directions simultaneously, and ultimately draws Golb's attention to U in the process. Golb consumes Finn, Simon, and Betty together, and inside the entity's body, in a sequence the show renders with genuinely strange, disorienting visual language, things are unmade and reassembled into simpler versions of themselves. Chaos, quite literally, digesting complexity and returning it to something closer to raw material. For Simon specifically, this consumption becomes, unexpectedly, a form of release rather than a form of destruction. Separated from the crown inside Golb's body, its ancient magic finally dissolved or absorbed by a force even stranger and older than the artifact itself. Simon emerges from the encounter as simply, fully, permanently himself again. For the first time in 1,000 years, old and powerless and entirely human, standing face to face with the woman who crossed a millennium to reach him. Betty, in the finale's final and most quietly devastating turn, does not simply rescue him and walk away. She makes a wish of her own, using the crown in its restored, original wish granting form, asking for the power to keep Simon safe permanently. And that wish, granted, does not simply protect him from a distance. It fuses her own consciousness directly with Golb itself, transforming the chaos entity into something the show's own supplementary materials refer to as Golbetty, a being that is neither fully Betty nor fully the original Golb, but some permanent, willing merger of the two. She departs forever in that new, transformed state, leaving behind only the crown, now empty, now finally quiet, and a Simon who has gotten his life and his sanity back at the exact cost of losing, all over again. The one person who spent 1,000 years trying to give it back to him. The Lich's own fate, meanwhile, is addressed only briefly, almost as an afterthought within the finale's broader epilogue material, and I think that muted, understated treatment is itself meaningful rather than simply a loose thread the writers ran out of time to tie off properly. We see Sweet Pea, grown into an adult 1,000 years after the finale's main events, wandering the land of as what the show frames as a genuine hero, apparently at peace, apparently whole, with no on-screen indication that the Lich's dormant presence inside him has ever resurfaced again after Gold Stars. Whether that means the Lich is genuinely gone, dissolved entirely by whatever process transformed him into an infant in the first place, or whether he is simply still there, still waiting, still patient, in exactly the way he has always been patient, sleeping quietly inside a good and gentle man, the same way he once slept quietly inside Amber, inside a snail, inside a small child on his first day of school. The show does not tell you. It simply shows you Sweet Pea, older now, kind now, apparently untroubled, and lets you decide for yourself whether that peace is permanent or merely the longest pause yet in a pattern that has repeated faithfully every single time this character has ever appeared to be finished. I find myself genuinely unable to decide, and I think that may be exactly the point. This is a being who has been imprisoned in amber for who knows how many centuries, released, defeated, driven into a snail, driven out of the snail, disguised as a dead hero, unmasked, wished out of existence, and then quietly, almost accidentally restored to existence by his own opponent's mercy, killed a wish-granting god and been imprisoned again for it, transformed into an infant, grown into a child, briefly resurfaced with a monologue about the true nature of the universe, and then gone quiet again for the rest of the story. Every single one of those defeats felt, in its moment, like it might finally be the last one. None of them actually were, until, perhaps, this final and most understated one, offered not as a dramatic climax, but as a brief, almost throwaway glimpse of an adult hero walking peacefully through a world that no longer seems to need saving from him. Here, then, is what I think this character actually means. Underneath every specific plot device the show ever built to carry him, and I want to offer this carefully, as my own reading rather than something the show states outright, because that distinction matters and I have tried to hold it all the way through tonight. The Lich is not simply a villain Adventure Time invented to give Finn and Jake something dangerous to fight. He is the show's most serious, most fully developed argument about what death actually is, underneath every individual, specific loss the story ever depicted. Every character we have spent time with across this channel, Simon losing himself to the crown, Marceline outliving everyone she has ever loved, Princess Bubblegum building an entire kingdom to fill a silence she never chose. All of them are living, in their own ways, with the ordinary, human scale version of what the Lich represents at cosmic scale: loss, ending, the slow or sudden removal of something that mattered. The show never suggests the Lich causes all of that grief directly, the way a villain in a simpler story might be blamed for every bad thing that happens to the people fighting him. What it suggests instead, patiently, across nearly a decade of careful, scattered mythology, is that the Lich is simply what that grief looks like if you trace it back far enough, past any individual cause, past any individual war or crown or catastrophe, down to something that existed before the universe itself did, waiting, the show's cosmology insists, before there was even nothing to wait inside. And yet the show never quite lets him win, not permanently, not in any way that sticks. Every single time he gets close, something small and specific and entirely unglamorous gets in his way. A sweater given out of affection rather than strategy, a friendship between a wish granter and a dog who would rather have a sandwich than save the world, until, at the last possible moment, he chooses the world instead. A robot naming a lonely, victorious monster Jerry, simply because giving things names is what that particular robot has always done, without any grander plan behind the gesture at all. An elderly elephant and her husband adopting an abandoned infant without asking any questions about where he came from. None of these moments defeat the Lich in any way that resembles a conventional final battle. They simply, quietly, repeatedly interrupt him, the way warmth interrupts cold, without ever fully explaining how it managed to do so, the way a small, imperfect ukulele recording, made in a cramped room with someone's typing audible in the background, somehow became the theme song for a show that turned out to be brave enough to put something this old and this frightening at the very bottom of its own mythology, and brave enough, too, to keep letting candy and kindness and ridiculous, gentle jokes about penguins interrupt him anyway, every single time, for 10 full seasons and everything that came after. That is the Lich. Older than the universe, by his own account, and still, somehow, never quite as old as the specific stubborn kindness that keeps finding ways to put him back to sleep. There is one more thing worth saying before we let this one rest, and it is less about the Lich specifically than about why a show ostensibly built for children ever felt the need to build a character like this at all, to spend real, sustained narrative effort across nearly a decade constructing a coherent cosmology of inevitable ending and then to bury it, mostly in the corners and the throwaway lines and the background snail nobody was supposed to notice. I think the answer has something to do with honesty, the same specific kind of honesty that let this show put ruined highways in the background of a joke about ice cream, the same honesty that let it show a grieving vampire singing her adoptive father's own forgotten love letters back to him without ever once explaining to its young audience exactly why that scene should feel as unbearably sad as it does. Children, this show seems to have believed, from its very first pitch document onward, already know that things end. They already understand loss in some inarticulate, pre-verbal way, long before anyone gives them the vocabulary for it, long before anyone explains what death actually means in terms an adult would recognize as complete. What they often lack is not the feeling itself, but a story large enough to hold it, something that takes the shapeless, wordless dread of endings and gives it an actual shape, a name, a design, a voice provided by a man best known for playing monsters, who turn out to have hidden softness underneath their monstrousness. The Lich is that shape. He is what it looks like when a show decides not to lie to its audience about the fact that some things really are older and larger and more patient than any single act of courage can permanently defeat, while simultaneously insisting, with everything else it ever built around him, that defeating him permanently was never actually the point of any of this in the first place. The point was always the sweater. The point was always the small, sincere, entirely unmagical things that interrupt him anyway, every time, not because they are stronger than he is in any way that could be measured, but because they keep showing up regardless of the math. Think for a moment about everyone this character actually touched across the full span of the story, and notice what they all have in common. Princess Bubblegum, possessed and nearly consumed by him, emerged smaller and younger and, in her own quiet way, more careful afterward about how much control she assumed she had over the things she claimed to protect. Finn, watching his own childhood hero's face tear open to reveal a grinning skull that had been wearing that hero's skin for who knows how many years, lost something that never fully returned, a certain uncomplicated faith in legends that the rest of the show gently, deliberately declines to give back to him. Prismo, killed outright, without ceremony, without a final speech, simply gone in the space of a single scene, a reminder that this is one of the only beings in the entire mythology whose victims do not always get a second act. And Sweet Pea, transformed from the very source of all of that damage into perhaps the single gentlest child the show ever gave us, carries all of it, silently, indefinitely, never once aware of what he is carrying, which might be its own kind of mercy or its own kind of tragedy, depending on which day you happen to be thinking about it. None of them asked for any of this. That, too, feels like the point. The Lich never operates as a punishment for anyone's individual failing, the way villains sometimes do in stories that want their audience to believe the world is at least fair enough to reserve its worst dangers for people who deserve them. He simply arrives. The way the Mushroom War simply arrived out of an arms race nobody fully controlled. The way grief simply arrives in anyone's life, regardless of how carefully they tried to live. Adventure Time never once suggests that any of its characters could have prevented what the Lich did to them by being wiser or braver or more prepared. It suggests, instead, something both bleaker and, I think, ultimately more comforting, that these things happen to people, all people, eventually, without any deeper logic governing who gets touched by them and who does not, and that the only real answer available to anyone standing in his path is not prevention, but response. What do you do afterward? Who do you become on the other side of it? Bubblegum built a kingdom. Marceline made an entire life out of grief, turned into music. Simon taught. Sweet Pea simply grew up kind, without ever knowing why kindness might have been the hardest possible outcome for someone carrying what he carries. I keep coming back, in thinking about all of this, to that image of him alone in the dead world of Jerry, the one timeline where he actually finished what he set out to do. 65 million years of patient work brought at last to total completion, and found, on the other side of it, absolutely nothing waiting for him. Not triumph, not rest, not even the satisfaction of having proven his own devotion to whatever he believed Golb wanted from him. Just an empty world and a small robot willing, out of nothing more than habit and reflexive kindness, to give the last living thing in it a name. I do not think that scene is really about the Lich at all, in the end. I think it is the show's most honest possible statement about what total victory over loss and ending would actually look like if anyone ever truly achieved it, for any of us, in any context, not paradise, not peace, just silence, and nothing left to lose because nothing is left at all, which turns out to be so much worse than the alternative that even the universe's own oldest agent of endings could not bear to stay there without eventually, quietly, accepting whatever small companionship happened to wander by. Maybe that is why the show could never quite let him win, and maybe that is why it could never quite let him disappear either. A story that took loss seriously enough to give it its own cosmology, its own voice, its own patient, 65 million year memory, owed that same loss the honesty of admitting it does not simply go away because a hero swings a sweater at it once, but a story built as warmly and as generously as this one. A story that let a small robot decide alone in the dark that a video game console could grow up to be a person. A story that let a demon's daughter keep a stuffed bear for 1,000 years because it was the last evidence that something good had once been real, could never quite let that same loss have the final, uncontested word either. So it sleeps. Somewhere in tonight. 1,000 years past everything we have talked about, an adult man who was once the most dangerous entity in the universe is very likely still walking around, kind and unaware, helping people, being a hero the way Finn and Billy before him were heroes, carrying underneath all of that the oldest thing this world has ever produced. And the show, for now, lets him keep walking. If you made it all the way down here with me tonight, thank you for staying. This channel exists because there are people out there who want to go this deep into a cartoon about a boy and his dog, who understand that the candy was never the point, that the point was always what the candy was covering up, and what it somehow, against every reasonable expectation, still managed to grow real warmth on top of. If that's you, consider leaving a like on your way out. It genuinely helps more people find their way down here. And if you want to come back for the next descent, the next layer of some other corner of this world, worth taking seriously, go ahead and subscribe. The land of has more waiting underneath it than most people ever bother to look for. We'll keep looking together. Rest well. The monsters, wherever they actually are tonight, can wait until next time.